I'm Doug Powell. Welcome to This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. The profession of design is changing at an almost unthinkable rate, and design leaders have emerged as pivotal and powerful figures in this change. In each episode of This is a Prototype, I invite two design leaders who have traveled very different life and career journeys to share their stories, to compare notes, and to talk about what it takes to be a leader in this new era of design. In this episode, I speak to Ashleigh Axios and Chris Hacker. Ashleigh Axios is a speaker, strategic creative, and an advocate for design's ability to break barriers and create positive social change. She is Chief Experience Officer and an owner of Coforma, a digital consultancy and design firm that crafts creative solutions and builds technology products to support communities. Ashleigh is also a term trustee of the Board of Directors to Rhode Island School of Design. Prior to her current roles, Ashleigh formed and led the in-house creative agency at Automatic. She served as the creative director and a digital strategist in the Obama White House, and separately served as president of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design, and of AIGA's Washington, D.C. chapter. Chris Hacker is Chief Design Officer at Hacker Design Group, a design consultancy specializing in product, brand, and experience design. Chris is a respected expert in design management and design for sustainability. Among his long list of corporate leadership roles, Chris was Vice President of Marketing and Design at Herman Miller, and prior to that, he was Chief Design Officer at Johnson & Johnson. Chris is also closely connected to Art Center College of Design, where he chaired the product design department and taught in both the product design and graduate graphic design programs. One of the things that I'm always curious about when I speak to design leaders is how they found design to begin with. I find that these origin stories can reveal a lot about how we work as designers and ultimately how we operate as design leaders. That's where I start my conversation with Ashleigh and Chris, and Ashleigh starts us off with her story.
My road is maybe a little less windy than some others. I get jealous of the windy paths sometimes that folks take and the meandering curiosities and the things that they pick up along the way. But I was a creative, kind of artsy kid. I always loved to draw, and my mom had been really talented at drawing, and she kind of put it down. She didn't end up going professional route. She didn't end up going to school for it, although she had an opportunity she was excited to for some time. So she was always very nurturing and especially encouraging of me in my creative endeavors, which I think is incredibly fortunate to have. And through that, she was often looking for other points of connection to make for me and people who are making it successfully creatively. And we had some limited options, but now that I reflect on it, I'm like, these were some big opportunities for like a young kid. So my mom's cousin, Ben Marshall, is a creative director for Uniworld Group, a Black advertising company in New York, and was doing wonderful things there. And so in middle school, she's like, why don't you go and shadow Uncle Ben and see what, that's all about? That seems like it would be fun. And he was just absolutely lovely. So I got to go and be on set for a Burger King commercial being shot, and they're asking me for feedback on things. I'm like, am I honestly supposed to give feedback? They're like, that's a Whopper. Like, does that make sense to kids? I was like, I'm a middle schooler. I don't know. I can't answer your questions. But it was so fun. And he was showing, he's like, well, that person over there, they have a lot of power. They're, directing the video, and, I hear how the roles play together, like the storyboard up on the side. So I was really inspired by that, and got to be in a brainstorm in their offices another time for Wild Cherry Pepsi commercial ideation. So I got some early exposure. I'm like, I think that's just normal. No, it's not very normal. Very early, like kind of in-depth community exposure. And I also had some family members. My great aunt Ruth is a jazz singer and artist. So even really young, being able to spend some time with her, looking at sculptures and paintings and the stuff in their studio. And I didn't know my My Aunt Camille was famous until like recently. But Camille Billups, the great aunt, and she was always, we'd go to her house to just put together family albums, and she was putting together salons to really document the Black experience in design and poetry. And she's passed just a couple years ago, but her life's collection with her husband has become a massive kind of record and part of a collection at Emory University. And so I'm like, I've been very, very fortunate to have people providing these different types of examples in art and design. And I think I'm still unpacking it, more and more as an adult. But I learned early that I loved, a lot about the strategy and intention and what my Uncle Ben did, but I didn't want to sell soda water. I loved how he was kind of talking to specific communities and the way it was like kind of that for us, by us community. So I was like, oh, how do you do some of that? And what are some paths into that? I loved, my aunt putting her art out into the world and her whole self with it. And I was lucky enough to have a teacher who recommended a certain art school and helped me see that design could be a pathway. I was, the artist was a little bit resistant to, and I was designing that, and then came to feel like design was actually, for me, more of like an entryway or stepping stone into using, turning art into that intentionality that I saw in my uncle's work. Like, I don't want to just do it to just express myself, although my values need to be there, but I still want to make things that are making an impact for other people. And I was super inspired by, in the 90s, Adbusters. I was like, I don't think I want to do that exactly either, but just this idea of being like thought-provoking and flipping the cultural conversation with criticism and talking about things like globalization. So I was in school, I was like, I have no idea how you put all these things together, but, this is the Venn diagram that's starting to, come together for me.
That is fascinating, Ashleigh, that to have those role models, well, your Uncle Ben and then others in your family so close to you, who provided an example of that there was something to pursue there. That's very rare in my experience. That's a really lovely story.
Thanks. And I think, the things that we're most scared of, my parents got divorced, and so we moved up with my mom's family and got even more embedded in her side of the family. That's stuff that was really scary for me, being 6 years old, but ended up being huge in my professional development because I got closer to these family members, and they really became more a part of, maybe not daily, but more a part of my regular life and a reference point. So I'm very fortunate.
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. Chris, let's jump in your time machine and take us back.
So I was, also very influenced by family members. My grandfather was a graphic designer who made metal stamped labels for things like perfume bottles, and he was amazing. He was all of the type he ever used was hand drawn. So I have some drawings of some of his work that was just amazing. So, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, sort of good Midwestern stock and
industrial town.
Industrial town. And the innovation that went on in Dayton, Ohio, things like the Wright brothers, who invented flying, and they ran a bicycle shop in Dayton. And NCR, National Cash Register, was there, and Frigidaire was invented. So it was a very industrial place. General Motors had lots of influence. So my grandfather did that. My father went to school and became a creative director and a painter and a photographer. And so in my childhood, he was the art director and chief photographer for the Dayton Daily News, which was the local paper, and meant that I kind of grew up with a drawing table in the dining room. All the tools of design and art. We were the kind of creative family in the community because people knew my grandfather and my father, and because of that, I got away with murder because I was allowed instead of writing a book report, I could make a movie, a little 8mm claymation movie of Great Expectations. And, that was a whole lot more fun than writing. It was a great way to be brought up. I was also, because my father was also a watercolor painter, we went to every exhibition within, 200 miles, to the art museums in Cincinnati and Columbus and Indianapolis. And also my older brother was becoming an architect at the University of Pennsylvania, studying with Louis Kahn. And for a long time, I wanted to be an architect, and I would build models of churches and buildings and houses. And then I kind of realized that I was going to have to compete with my older brother for the architecture world. So fortunately, my parents in 1967 decided that we were going to go to the Montreal World's Fair, Expo 67. I was 17, so it was kind of junior in high school. I was kind of looking around for what I might do. And first of all, the place, the Expo 67 with the geodesic, Bucky Fuller's dome and all of the pavilions, which were just amazing objects of design, that inspired me. But then there was an ICSID, which is the International Coalition of Industrial Designers. They had an exhibition of industrial design work. And I walked into that exhibition, spent, half the day there because I was fascinated by absolutely everything. And I had always been kind of mechanical. I was always interested in making things and putting things together. And seeing that there was this thing called industrial design that I could actually do was a revelation. And so I never looked back. I went back to high school, applied to the University of Cincinnati, which has a really great industrial design program, and did then and still does actually. And went to school, and that was kind of it. During school, during UC, I also came across Victor Papanek, who wrote a book called Design for the Real World, which changed my view of what design ought to be about. And I realized that there was a responsibility that designers had to make things socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and engaged for humanity, rather than, as at the time, industrial designers really were just making products that, were going to end up in the landfill and designed to be sold, as opposed to designed to be functional for humanity. And so it took me a while to get there, but I was eventually able to apply those rules to the companies that I worked for.
Yeah, I am blown away by these two stories. I had no idea. In pairing the two of you, I thought they'll probably get along, and they've probably got some interesting things to say. But these two stories and the family stories are really remarkable and so rare for me. I'm so envious. I grew up with no lovely family in many ways, but none of what the two of you are talking about with family members close to you having so doing the work that or close to the work that you ended up pursuing. And I want to pick up on the sort of the human impact thread there for a moment, Chris. And Ashleigh, you mentioned it too in passing as you were observing your Uncle Ben and the Burger King and the Pepsi and so on, and you thinking, well, okay, this is cool, but maybe not for the soda water. Tell me how that came together for you. Was that like as Chris explained it, kind of came together in a fairly concise moment, or was that an evolution for you?
I think I found early on that I was trying to piece these things together. I didn't know exactly how, and it took some time. I won't say it's one moment. I do think my time in RISD in the graphic design program we had a lot of leeway to choose topics for our projects. And I found myself going towards, more policy, social issues, economic issues, wanting to talk about like big human things as topics. And it's like, oh, I get to write what the topic is for this, as long as I'm generating a book that meets X criteria, or, the stamp piece. And sometimes, getting a little bit of pushback, because at least at the time, the norm was more like, okay, we're making stamp, just make it American. And it was like, well, I'm making a stamp for, apartheid, South Africa, and the fight for liberation, and the African National Congress. And like, let's talk about the symbolism that makes sense there. They're like, what? Why so heavy? I'm like, making a book, Ashleigh, does it have to be on like female genital mutilation? It's like, can you go maybe a little bit lighter this time? But those are the issues that were, the ones that I cared to talk about and wanted to be in dialogue about. So I was kind of making the connections happen myself, but it felt like kind of going against the stream in a lot of ways. And I found myself frustrated at times, but it was also, sometimes frustration in itself is fuel. So I was pouring that, back into just experimenting and trying to follow my values, learn the craft, explore deeper in some of these issue areas, and trust that I would find more connections and more like-minded folks over time. And I was fortunate that it did work out, but I do think I got some side looks along the way until it started paying off, because you get an opportunity to intern at Hearst in a beautiful building, and it's overlooking, Central Park. And here's Ashleigh. She chooses the other one and goes to the smelly, worm poop, Trenton-based, nonprofit option for, it's not going to pay or anything either. That's a choice that you can make.
Yeah.
So I think it looked a little weird to my colleagues, like they're going towards MTV at the time and Martha Stewart, and I was like,
high visibility, big brand stuff. Yeah. Chris, what about how did that aspect of your work, which I know is so central to your work, how did that emerge?
Well, it did. It took 10, 12 years to get there. My first job out of school was with Henry Dreyfuss Associates, the designers of Singer sewing machines and telephones and Polaroid cameras. And, they were not interested in my questioning whether the little part I was working on for a Polaroid camera was actually being made sustainably, or whether this camera should actually even be made, because it's a dumb camera that, everybody, going to throw away. But they weren't interested, and that was fine. And I kept plugging away until I finally was able, when I, significantly later went to work for Aveda, which had been acquired by, the funny story is I worked for Estee Lauder earlier in my career, and I left screaming because I couldn't get done the kinds of things, and I couldn't convince the people at Estee Lauder that they ought to be paying attention to what's the material in this bottle we're making, and why are we wrapping this in 5 layers before we send it off to the consumer? It needs to be, simplified. I mean, they basically ignored me and told me to go back and do the things they asked me to do. And so I left there at one point. And then several years later, they called and said, the woman I worked for called and said, hey, we just acquired Aveda, and I remember you talking about this sustainability thing, and can you come help us? And I was sort of like, well, I don't really know. I don't know. That ship sort of sailed. But then I didn't like you the first time around. Yeah, exactly. I looked into it and I realized, oh my God, this is a huge opportunity, because the company Aveda had been around for 25 years and had been doing, in its own small little way, all the right things around sustainability and social good and They were very early adopters of sustainable packaging. So I said, sure, I'll come do that. I went back to New York and spent a good bit of time being able to directly apply what I had always wanted to, which was think about where this is going to end up. What's the social good that can come from the products we make and the way we purchase materials. And so it was quite an experience.
Huh. That's fascinating.
I love that we kind of have opposite successful journeys in, right? Like I think went to some like value places until I grew in order to be into a place that maybe didn't have fully those values, that I could start to like manipulate it from the inside or push for some of that change. But I love hearing the story of, going in somewhere, and even if you're leaving a hint of that future that ends up being picked back up later on and coming back.
I'm a big believer in the idea of being covert about how the issues that get applied should get applied. I mean, I went to Johnson & Johnson later, Johnson & Johnson, big, giant corporation, kind of okay, good moral stance, sort of. But, a company that, steamrolled over a lot of things. But it gave me an opportunity to kind of direct them in a direction that sort of changed their footprint a little bit. So I like this idea of working inside company. Many people say, "Oh, I can't work for the man. I need to go do." I like the idea of working for the man and convincing him that there's a better way to do something.
Those were the years that you and I got to know each other, Chris, and I remember so well and so clearly that covert kind of spirit that you had.
You had to do what you needed to do, but you also had the opportunity because you were making decisions about what the company was going to do, and as long as it didn't adversely affect the bottom line, which in many cases it positively affected the bottom line because we eliminated packaging, we reduced the volume of things. We did all the right stuff, and it was so everybody was happy. The woman I worked for was a capitalist in big bold letters, but she understood that I had the company's back in trying to make it both do better, be better, and cost less.
Yeah,
it's a good thing.
Yeah. We're already starting to hint at the themes of leadership. So let's kind of go there. And I'm curious with both of you if you can trace your sort of when and how you initially began leading, and that doesn't mean a job title or a promotion or anything formal necessarily, or maybe it does, but rather when the behaviors started to take shape for you, and what were the circumstances for that? Ashleigh, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'll share a weird little story to kick it off to kind of illustrate. But I went to South Africa for a student winter session project that was self-directed one year abroad. And it was a project that was on the intersection of AIDS relief and design. I was really excited about. But that's not the story I'll share. I had this weird little encounter with a local resident that stuck with me, where it's a local pastor. I didn't talk to him very long. Maybe I said my name, we were introduced and some context. And he looked me right in the face and said that I didn't have to worry that I'd be a leader. And I was like, that's interesting. And it's not every day you have somebody you don't really know, like making kind of predictions about your life.
Proclamations.
Yes. Based on, I don't know the way you look. I can't explain, that encounter really. Maybe it was something in the way I was carrying myself. Maybe I had like a tell, right? Like something about myself. But I think it stuck with me because I did feel seen in that moment. And like he was reading me like a book and kind of knew this like transition point I was kind of working through who knows how. But it struck me that I did want to be a leader. And in many ways, I was already beginning that journey for myself, that I was starting to try to own it. Like, to back up, I had a really, I won't get into details, but like rough high school experience in a lot of ways, and kept losing myself in the realities of my experience and trying to hold it together for family and friends, and, sometimes denying really important parts of myself in the process, and trying to be the glue, and trying to hit this like impossible standard for exceptionalism. It's Pride Month right now, so say, hello to my bisexuality and having a family that was one of the first 2 Black families in an all-white community, and largely being raised by my mom and with the support of my grandmother, all that stuff, and no judgment on them is like a part of the pressure that kind of built up on me early on. But I hit a breaking point and a low point in my life early on, and I'd say that I'm actually fortunate for it because I hit it at 17. And a lot of people hit that late in life, and they'll realize when they do this kind of, and now we'd say like YOLO mentality that comes afterwards. And I was starting to come out of that, after 17, being like, you know what, if I can be so resilient, so giving to others, be this like leader in my family, trying to solve and wear all the hats in these different ways, in this kind of giving way, then why can't I do that for myself, for my own future, to map out the way that I want things to be, to live truly in who I am and my own identity. So what happened to me? What am I going to do about it? So what of my fear of heights? I'm going to go bungee jump from the tallest spot in the world. I'm going to go skydive. So what, I'm shy. I'm going to lean into public speaking. Like, what do I actually have to lose from any of this, right? I just have upside and gain in leaning into these things. And really this mentality of like, who cares how I'm feeling about it? What matters is what I want to achieve, and that I can work through to achieve that, and I can be true to myself. Yeah, that's a very long, probably way for me to say that, I think I went from being really selfless leader as a child in ways that I hope no child really should be, and hit bottom, and then learned that I could be a leader of my own goddamn life. Fortunately, really freaking early on. So I'd say kind of own it throughout my life, but really taking the reins of it starting in, my early adult life. And that's made it much easier for me professionally from really early on to say, no, that's in alignment. This is in alignment with my values. That's not in alignment with my values. Yes, no. Or like, you might not like me after this conversation, but we're going to have it. Yeah. And it's totally fine. And I'm going to live and you're going to live.
We're going to be fine.
And then just kind of move through life. And that's obviously not in a callous way, because I'm actually a very sensitive, empathetic person, but channeling that in a way that's just true to myself. And I think that's shown up in my leadership style as I've gotten new skills and, of course, opportunities over time.
Wow. So this inner, gosh, the first word that came to mind was fortitude, but that seems a little blunt. It was more like a clarity or an inner strength for sure, but kind of a clarity of self that really seems to have guided you from a very early age, or what I think is a very early age.
I think so. Now that I'm getting older, it's been a while. I really do feel like I'm fortunate to have hit such a point so early, because it just makes decision making so much more clear when you've hit that point early on.
Wow, Chris, take us through your leadership journey, where there are sort of light bulbs and realizations for you.
I don't know, using Ashleigh's high school metaphor, I was the artistic kid in the high school. I designed the sets for the plays, and I designed the yearbook, and I did all that kind of stuff. And my junior year, there was this thing in this is so Midwestern, for Labor Day in Kettering, Ohio, called Holiday at Home, which is a parade and it's like the end of summer thing, and all of the schools and churches and organizations built floats to send down the road in this parade. I decided that my high school was going to do the best possible float for this thing. This is so minor and stupid, but there's a point to this story, so stick with me here. So I spent the summer designing and building this float out of chicken wire and paper pump, the whole making floats kind of thing. And it had motion. It was, the theme was south of the border for the whole parade for some reason. Nobody understood what that really meant. We did this dancing mariachi person and band in these 20-foot high figures on this float that moved and did, they did things. I designed it, and then I ran getting it made. And my mother, who, bless her, was always a little worried that I was going to be too inward and not capable of being, and my mother, having grown up in the Depression, was very conscious of, you guys have to go out. She had 4 boys. I was the youngest of 4 boys. You all have to go out and, make a living and stay in a job and, build your retire. It was all about surviving in a world. So she told me after that she was no longer worried about me because I had been able to organize and get done and on a timeline for Memorial, for Labor Day, at 10 o'clock when the parade had to start. It got finished and it won best float. My favorite part of it was my mother coming to me and saying, I was worried about you, but I'm not anymore.
You really won a couple different ways there, right?
Yeah, it was a really good experience. And, now, 55 years later, I'm telling that story again. It was the beginning of my realizing that I could organize people and get things done and figure out how to make it happen. And then there's a failure story that comes after this. I had 2 jobs. I worked for Henry Dreyfuss and then JCPenney and then got a job as, Doug, do you know who Rita Sue Siegel is?
Yes.
Actually, you're too young to know who she is, but she was in industrial design and graphic design in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. She was the headhunter par excellence.
She was the one.
She was the one. And so when I got out of school, I went to see her. And in New York, I flew up to New York and waited in her lobby and showed my 12 slides. And basically, she sent me to Henry Dreyfuss the next morning, and they offered me a job in an hour later. And
is this your failure story? Yeah, it's all here to go.
This is the beginning of the failure story. I'll tell you the whole story in a minute. Sorry, but she got me a job. I went to work there. It was great. Then 2 jobs later, she stayed in touch with me, and she called me up and she said, I have the job for you. It's the manager of design for GAF Corporation. And I thought, wow, great. Rita Sue thinks I can do this. I can go do this. And it was taking over for a guy who'd been in the role for 10 years, who was a guy named Paul Miller, who designed the GAF logo, which is still in existence. He was an amazing creative director. And somehow, I don't know why he left, but he left. And so they were looking to replace him. And they hired me. And I was 29 years old. I had never managed anybody other than the guys in the float.
Yeah, I was going to say, did your mom call them up and endorse you?
And I went into an organization that existed. So, there were 12 people who now reported to me, most of whom were older and more experienced than I was. Several of them were irritated because they didn't get the job. And so I went into this role and I failed because I had no idea how to manage people. I was not sensitive to what needed to be done. I couldn't, and I was gone in a year because it was complete and utter failure. I mean, it's the kind of thing that looking back on it, I'm a little surprised I came out of it because it was so traumatic for me to have, been successful in everything I'd sort of done up to that point and then go to this job. And Rita Sue, who keeps track of everything, saw this very public, in her view, failure of me. And, it was years before she even suggested me for another job.
Really?
So, yeah. So it was a big learning curve. Actually, I ended up after that at Estee Lauder for that stint I talked about a little bit ago, which was magical and it was great until I realized I couldn't do the things I wanted to do. Yeah. But
what you mentioned the things in the GAF role that you didn't know how to do, managing people. Can you talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, I think
what else? What were the failures there? Like what?
I think I didn't listen. I was not listening to people. I came in and sort of understood that my role was to tell people what to do, which is how I had been treated at other places. I sort of learned from my where I worked before about how I was treated as a young designer. And so I treated these people who were wildly experienced, knew exactly what they were doing, with not much respect, I suspect, and, not understanding the culture. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that the culture of an organization is critical to its success. And the way people interact and talk to each other and behave with each other counts. Doug, you'll remember this at J&J. Half of what I tried to do there was build a culture of design thinking within this group that was not just about the products we were working on, but the broader culture of the world and how we as designers could help affect that by doing the things we were doing. Yeah. And so, at GAF, I had no idea of any of that.
Right.
And I also had a complicated relationship with my boss because he wanted me to, he was in a cost cutting, we need to, I have a feeling that was probably part of why Paul left, because this guy was making noises about reducing the cost of design. And I was trying to figure out what that meant and still make interesting, it was.
Yeah.
And a year later I left.
It sounded like you were sort of pretending or imitating leadership qualities that you had observed either in previous roles or
yep.
leaders that you had reported to. Ashleigh, anything about your background as you go through your history as a leader and any similarities there or differences in early leadership roles for you?
Yeah, I can totally emphasize. I think we've all had bad bosses, and it's so tricky to navigate, how to learn the lessons of and recover from the trauma of having a bad employer. And being a business owner today and having our people ops and HR functions, as well as our design department and marketing communications report directly through me, I'm constantly thinking about the way employee culture and experience impacts everything that we're able to generate as a service-based company, and kind of how we can help people adapt to being in a safe and welcoming environment, just given the traumas that they've experienced in the past. It's bringing up a ton for me, and just that more on the stuff right now of we're trying to have constant conversations, especially with managers and newer managers, about our ways to working in management and how to shake off the bad experiences, because it's really easy to kind of snap back in. As Chris, you did. I think a lot of people, we have that tendency at times when we're under pressure or fear, especially those tense, traumatic circumstances, which it sounds like you were under constantly, right? To just, react and to go into a certain mode. And now how to be conscious not to trigger that for one another and to shake those, those ideas and those ways of working before we hit the stress, that moment, the big project, or when that type of thing comes up. So yeah, I can really, really kind of well to those experiences. I think for me, some of the challenging things when I was coming up as a leader was just kind of entering the professional field, was owning that my skill development was in my own hands. I think how I was raised and how education works in the United States, there was so much like programming and like, oh, you're at that grade and you're getting grades and like everything is rated. And then you graduate and it's like learning is all on you now. Figure it out. Figure out how well you're doing. And especially if you're in places that don't have a community or a culture of feedback. So I took a lot of time early on to try to figure out how to build soft skills. How do I know if I'm better at client communications, talking with bosses to get feedback and try to navigate, am I getting better at this? I didn't have any exposure before. Are clients happy? How do you know if our clients are happy? Just trying to build up almost these own courses for myself. I graduated graphic design degree, so digital experience and communication experience, asking for projects that would help me skill build and seeking feedback and trying to almost create my own curriculum so that I could develop and then help others along. I do believe in that learning and teaching as you go can help you lock in the learnings that you have. And I think it's also helped me be perceived more as a leader because, I was an intern, 2 months ago, but now I'm showing the interns how to do a thing. And
yeah,
suddenly, you're seen more as a leader in a group and a collective. So spend a lot of time finding those cycles to try to build experience and get into that personal state of continual development. But it's tough, and every environment's a little bit different. So kind of feeling out. I went into one job, maybe like you, Chris, where it was like, oh, this is going to be a 6-month job. Sometimes, you're like, all right, this in mind, what am I going to try to learn?
I learn here, right?
Yeah.
Before I leave, this is not the...
Hang on.
It's interesting you bring up this idea of education because, one of the things that that we as a society don't do very well is teach creative people about things like management. The idea is that in a design school, all of the students are presumed to be going on to creative jobs where they do the same creative work for the rest of their careers. And that's not the case. And so when I went to Art Center to begin teaching, one of the things I was really interested in doing was developing a design management curriculum so that these graduate graphic designers, because that's where I sort of started at Art Center, would have at least a little underpinning of what it means to be a designer managing other designers out in the world. And it doesn't mean giving up creative control or being creative yourself. It means how do you think about, how's the world organized, and how do you think about what your place in it is and what you can do to make this work better. So that was, your like self-teaching instinct is really great. And I would encourage you to go teach somewhere so that you begin to get those students, young designers, to understand that it's not all just about making pretty pictures and doing the creative work that they're being trained to do, and that there's benefit both for yourself, for society, for the companies, for the clients.
And I think we're kind of circling around the thesis of this podcast series, which is really we are among the first generation of leaders leading scaled design teams in this profession, and there is your curriculum notwithstanding, Chris, there's no playbook for it. The self-learning is really necessary in order for us to find our way through these new roles. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I'm also curious with both of you how your design superpowers show up in those leadership moments where, and Chris, we were talking a moment ago about you sort of imitating some of those leadership behaviors, and that didn't really go very, very well for you in the GAF role. But are there moments when, intentionally or not, your design skills are kind of coming to the surface as you're leading? Ashleigh, can you think of anything? I mean, you were talking earlier about drawing in your very earliest, years of discovering this path. Maybe visualization is a way that contributes to how you lead.
Yeah, that is a big way. I say, I love making the complex clear and understandable and for varied audiences. So that shows up a lot. It's super handy when you're co-running a business in a fast-growing business and a complicated ecosystem. And Coforma, we do work in government in part as part of our audience. And with that comes government procurement and evaluation and all these things that are nuanced and hard to take people through, let alone kind of break down and onboard and orient folks to. Taking the time to distill it, making flow charts, writing, creating guides, whether I'm using kind of visual writing, UX, or information architecture skills. For me, it all still just shows up. It's just usually in less traditional formats in the spaces that people aren't necessarily anticipating it. I'm like, let's talk about, the next branch of our skills matrix internally and co-design what career growth looks like in this organization. Well, we co-design all the time in our client services project, but being able to turn that lens inside to how we operate as a business and making sure that employees are heard and part of the process, and then that things are made clear for people who weren't part of the discussion or coming in a step later. Those are all, superpowers that makes it a little bit easier for a business owner to kind of get a leg up and get to clarity faster. I think having some of those skills in place. And I think our employees appreciate, and I'm certainly not the only one in our leadership. My business partner has a design background as well, but just how human-centered we are in our approach in general. It kind of exudes through in everything that we do, and it allows people to know that we'll always be keeping them in mind, regardless of the format, that is, a core part of our values and how we operate in general. That's not specific to the design arm. That is consistent regardless of the role inside the business.
So you're really explicitly kind of baking it into the DNA of the company, which is really, really a beautiful approach. Chris, anything you can think of? I keep going back to the J&J years for you, and you were, such an alien creature for most of the circles that you were traveling in there. Well,
I think it's interesting. When I began the process of potentially going to work at J&J, I started out, actually, I was at Aveda, and a headhunter kept calling me for a job at Neutrogena, which was a division of J&J. They wanted a marketing person, and at Aveda, I was the head of marketing and design, because within Aveda, marketing's really about design. So it made sense that I did that. But I am no way near a marketer. Classic marketing professional is not me. I was about kind of creating experience, which is why it worked at Aveda. But the headhunter had to target companies that J&J wanted to look for this role at Neutrogena, and so Aveda was one of them. And the guy was so persistent that I just finally said, okay, I'll go meet him, and they flew me out to California. I had a lunch and then a long chat with the guy who was the president of Neutrogena, and both of us knew in minutes that I wasn't the guy they were looking for, because they needed, high level, focused, numbers based, advertising focused kind of marketing head, and I wasn't that person. But in the middle of lunch, he said to me, hey, my boss is trying to figure out design at Johnson & Johnson. I think she'd benefit from a conversation with you. Would you mind if I set that up? And I said, sure. One of the rules that I learned early in my career was take every meeting. And if somebody wants to talk to you, go talk to them. It may not lead somewhere. It may lead somewhere. May lead to something completely different. But it's always worth talking to people because you learn something. And so I took the meeting. Colleen Goggins was the woman I met. She was the chairman of J&J. And she and I met at a hotel in Manhattan for tea one afternoon. We started the meeting maybe at 3:00, and it was supposed to be an hour long. And at 6:00, we closed the place down because she had such an interesting idea about what she needed to do. I had never even considered going into this meeting that I might be interested in helping her do it. What was interesting about it was that it was bringing the design skill that they had always acquired by using outside consultants, bringing it into the company. And I had always wanted to, kind of do that because, again, coupling with that idea, I can do great things for the company, but I can also aim them in the right direction. So, we did that. She said, so what would you do? How would you do this? And I gave her sort of 4 points about how to set this up. Would have to be in Manhattan because I could only find good designers in Manhattan. Couldn't be in New Jersey where their headquarters is. I needed to report to her as opposed to, every company on the planet thinks that design ought to report to marketing. Well, I don't agree with that. Design needs to report to the top of the business and be a partner with marketing, connected to marketing in a very deep way and sympathetic to marketing, but not report to, because reporting to means they say, make it pink and I need it by next Tuesday. That was the second thing. Third thing was we needed to build a center for the activity of design within the company that would become a hub for the company. And the fourth thing was I needed Macintosh computers. She said, her exact answer was 1, 2, and 3, no problem. We're going to do it. Number 4, I'm a little worried about. I'm not sure I can convince the IT people to let you have Macs, because at that point, J&J was the largest user of Microsoft software on the planet. But we did it, and it worked. So that's leadership in my view. She was a mentor for me in a way that was about ask people what they need. If you think it's going to work, agree with them and let them do it. That's really a big part of the success.
We are unbelievably at time here. What an amazing discussion. And my goodness, we traveled a lot of territory there around the world and to Dayton and back. I'm so grateful to both of you for joining me and your openness to share these amazing stories and your journeys. Thank you so much, Ashleigh Axios and Chris Hacker. Much appreciated.
Thanks for
It's really fun. Thank you.
That's all for this episode of This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. Special thanks to Scott Leach of Brandspeak Communications for his production assistance, and to Graham Barton for his original theme music. I'd love for you to help me grow the audience for this podcast by liking and following it on your favorite podcast platform. And I'd also love your help finding great design leaders for future episodes of the show. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn with your ideas. You can also find out more about my work as a design leader on my website, dougpowell.design. Thanks for listening. Until next time.